My girlfriend and I had heard about this app called Randonautica and decided to try it out one Friday night, just to see if it was as creepy as people said. For those who don't know, the app basically picks a random place for you to go based on coordinates around your location. The idea is that, with some intention in mind, it takes you to strange or unusual spots. Our intention was just adventure, a way to break the routine and do something different on that quiet night. The coordinates it generated led us to this hidden, kind of secluded park in the city. I knew the place existed but had never actually been there, so it felt like the perfect start for a little adventure. When we got there, the place was way creepier than I expected. It wasn't your typical park with lights and people walking around. It felt almost abandoned, with a few flickering lights and an odd, heavy silence. There was this kind of darkness that made you question if you should even be there. As we were walking down one of the paths, my girlfriend suddenly stopped and showed me something she found on the grass. An old, beat-up backpack, tossed aside and open. It looked like it had been there for a while, but the weird thing was that, inside, there was a folded piece of paper with a message scrawled on it. The writing was messy, but we could make out help and a line begging for assistance. That note made us super uncomfortable. My first instinct was to leave it there and just go. I thought it was probably some prank or something, but my girlfriend hesitated, looking around, trying to make sense of it. She even suggested we should look around a bit, maybe see if there was any clue as to what happened, but I just wanted to get out of there. The whole vibe of the park was already off, and with that handwritten plea for help, everything felt even more disturbing. We decided it was best to leave the backpack alone and kept walking, trying to ignore what we had just seen. That's when we started hearing footsteps. At first, we thought it was just the wind or maybe a small animal, but gradually, it became clear it was something else. The steps were firm, steady, echoing in the empty park. Every time we looked back, we saw a figure standing still, watching us from a distance. They never got closer, but it felt like they were keeping just enough distance to make sure we knew they were there. It started giving me chills. I tried to act like I wasn't scared, but honestly, all I wanted was to get out of there as fast as possible. That feeling of being followed started to mess with us. I kept trying to keep my cool, but it was impossible not to look over my shoulder every few steps, hoping to see that person moving away. But every time we looked, there they were, standing in the same spot, just watching. We couldn't make out a face or even tell if it was a man or a woman. The darkness hid every detail. The tension kept building, and ignoring the backpack and the note now felt like a mistake. My girlfriend was clutching my arm, and I could tell she was just as freaked out as I was. We decided to leave the park by taking the shortest path out, trying not to look back anymore. We walked fast, but without running, hoping not to make things worse. When we finally saw our car, I felt this huge sense of relief. I was counting down the seconds to get out of there and go home. We got in the car quickly, and as I started the engine, I noticed that the figure was no longer visible. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that it was just someone trying to mess with us, but the whole night already felt way too strange. When we got back home, that relief I felt in the car started to fade. Everything was way too quiet, but not in a relaxing way. It was more like there was something still wrong, like a shadow from that night had followed us home. My girlfriend seemed to feel the same thing because, as soon as we got in, she took one last look out the window and pulled the curtains shut quickly. We tried to distract ourselves, turned on the TV, but the image of that backpack and the figure in the park kept flashing back in my mind, like a memory I couldn't shake off. I thought about just forgetting it, but something about the whole thing wouldn't let me. A few hours later, I decided to take one last look outside, and what I saw made my heart drop. There was a note stuck to the windshield of the car, and my first thought was that it was just some ticket or maybe a flyer. But when I got closer and read what it said, my whole body froze. The message, written in big, rushed letters, read, "Why didn't you help me?" I felt this chill crawl up my spine, a mix of guilt and fear. It didn't make sense. How could someone know that we ignored that cry for help in the park? I looked around, but the street was completely empty. I grabbed the note and went back inside, still in shock. My girlfriend noticed right away that something was wrong, but I couldn't even get the words out. I just handed her the paper, and she went pale the second she read it. We were officially terrified. This couldn't be a coincidence. Someone, somehow, knew what we'd seen and what we'd done that night. I couldn't understand how anyone could have followed us all the way home without us noticing, and the thought that they might still be out there, watching, made my skin crawl. We ended up staying up the rest of the night, trying to make sense of it all. Every little noise outside made us jump, and I couldn't shake the image of the backpack, the figure in the park, and that plea for help. I kept telling myself it had to be some messed up prank, but there was just something deeply wrong about it all. I knew it wasn't just paranoia. To this day, I still wonder if we ignored someone who truly needed help, or if we got pulled into some kind of trap. Either way, that message on the car sticks in my head, like a haunting reminder that won't ever really go away. I had heard of the Randonautica app before, the one that sends you to random places based on an intention you set, but I never actually thought I'd use it. It was one of those days where I was just bored out of my mind and needed something to keep my son, Jake, entertained. He was bouncing off the walls, so I figured a little adventure wouldn't hurt. I set the app up, let him pick the intention, something like fun or play, and off we went. When the app gave us the location, I was kind of surprised. It wasn't far, but it led us to this corner of a public park that I didn't even know existed. I thought maybe it was some hidden playground, which actually sounded fun. When we got there, I saw it was definitely hidden for a reason. It looked like this old, forgotten play area. The equipment was rusty in spots, the paint was peeling, and the ground was covered in dried leaves, like nobody had been there in ages. But Jake didn't care about any of that. Kids don't care about rust or chipped paint. He just ran over to a swing, laughing and calling it his secret playground. It was cute, so I let him play, but there was this weird vibe in the air that I just couldn't shake. As he jumped from one piece of equipment to another, I started noticing small things scattered around. Little toys, like plastic cars, an old doll missing an arm, even a pacifier that had yellowed over time. It didn't look like regular park trash, more like someone had just left them there on purpose. It sent a weird chill down my spine, but I tried to ignore it and just kept my focus on Jake, who was talking to himself, or so I thought. When I asked him who he was talking to, he just laughed and said he was playing with his new friend. I found it cute and left him to it, figuring it was just kid stuff. After a bit, I decided to take some photos of the place and of Jake playing, just to remember this secret playground we'd found. He looked like he was having the time of his life. Every picture I took, he was smiling or looking off to the side, like he was actually playing with someone. We spent a little while there, but that uneasy feeling I had just kept growing. I finally told him it was time to go, and he pouted a bit, saying his friend didn't want him to leave. I laughed it off, saying his invisible friend could come and play some other time, but deep down, I just wanted to get out of there. When we got home, Jake went straight to his toys like nothing happened, but I couldn't shake that weird feeling from the park, so I decided to transfer the photos to my phone and take a closer look. The first picture showed him on the swing, smiling and looking to the side. Pretty normal, but when I zoomed in, I noticed what looked like a shadow next to him, kind of blurry. I thought it might just be a smudge or something I hadn't seen at the time, but it looked strange. I went to the next photo, and there he was on the slide, smiling again. And there was that shadowy figure, still a bit blurry, right beside him. With each photo, that shadow kept showing up, and I started to get chills. I tried to find a logical explanation, like maybe it was just the way the sun was positioned, or maybe something was stuck to my lens. But no matter how I looked at it, the shadow was always there, right next to Jake, like it was following him around. I kept scrolling, feeling more and more uneasy, like I was on the verge of seeing something worse. And then I got to one of the last photos, where he was on the jungle gym, looking right at the camera, and next to him, that shadow seemed more defined, almost like it had a face. At that moment, A cold wave of dread washed over me. I tried to push away the thought that it could be something paranormal, but the more I looked, the more real that figure seemed. It wasn't just my imagination anymore. There was something next to my son, and I had missed it entirely while we were there. I thought about asking Jake what he'd seen or felt at the park, but a part of me didn't want to bring it up. Some instinct told me it was better to just let it go, as if talking about it could somehow make things worse. That night, I couldn't stop going over those photos, zooming in and looking for answers that I couldn't find. I tried to get some sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow moving around the park, always right next to Jake, like it was waiting for him. I kept waking up to the slightest noises, convinced that something had followed us home. Even though I never told him what I saw, Jake seemed different the next day, like something was weighing on him. He didn't ask to go back to the secret playground, and honestly, I didn't ever plan to bring it up again. The next day, still trying to make sense of everything, I decided to delete all the photos. I know it might sound extreme, but I felt like it was the only way to shake off that feeling. But before I deleted them, I showed one to a close friend, without saying much, just to get her reaction. When she looked at the picture, her face went pale, and she asked me, almost whispering, who was standing next to Jake. In that moment, my last hope that it was all in my head disappeared. Seeing her reaction was the final confirmation that whatever was in those pictures, it wasn't normal. After that, I deleted each photo, one by one, as if I was erasing something haunting. But even though the pictures are gone, what happened that day is burned into my memory. I still find myself going over it, thinking of every little detail, but nothing can explain that shadowy presence next to Jake. Sometimes I catch myself picking up my phone, almost like I expect to see the picture still there. And I can't forget the look my friend gave me when she saw it. It was like she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to. Since that day, I've never used Randonautica again, and I'm careful about wandering off to unknown places. Every time we go somewhere new, I keep an eye on everything around us, feeling like that friend could show up again. Jake never mentioned the secret playground or his imaginary friend after that, but sometimes he asks me in a strange way if we can go back there. I don't know if he remembers what happened or if he just dreams about the place, but I always tell him the park is closed now. Closed for good. Me and two friends decided to go on a quick weekend trip. We just wanted to relax and get away, so we rented a simple cabin in a more remote area. The GPS took us most of the way, but when we were about 20 minutes out, it started losing signal, as expected, and suggested an alternate route. Now, these dirt roads never looked promising, but we figured it was just a detour to get back to the main road. Except, this shortcut started taking us deeper into nowhere, and that feeling of relaxation suddenly turned into discomfort. The dirt road was bumpy, surrounded by thick trees, and it seemed like the further we drove, the more isolated we got. After a few minutes down that road, we spotted a car stopped right in the middle of the path. At first, we thought it was just a car that broke down, but as we got closer, I started noticing details that made me feel uneasy. The hood was popped open, and the driver's door was half open. Something felt off about the whole scene, like the car had been abandoned in a hurry. We exchanged glances, not saying much, but it was clear we all felt that same chill. None of us were the type to scare easily, and maybe that's what pushed us to actually pull over and check it out. But once we got out and took a closer look, things only got weirder. The first thing I noticed was random personal stuff scattered around the car, like someone had left in a rush. There was a jacket thrown on the back seat, an old, broken phone on the ground, and a backpack open with clothes and other stuff spilling out. The whole vibe was so weird that one of my friends, Mark, started saying we should probably just turn around. But at the same time, we were too curious. We stood there, trying to make sense of what could have happened. We were on this deserted road, with no one around, and the idea that someone would just abandon their car like that felt stranger by the second. So, I walked over to the driver's door and took a peek inside. And that's when we heard it. a sound that made all of us freeze. It was like someone stepping on dry leaves in the woods, just off to the side of the road, pretty close to where we were standing. We went silent, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from, but all we could see was darkness between the trees. My friends looked at me, waiting for me to say something, but I was just as frozen as they were, trying to make sense of what could be out there. It didn't sound like an animal. The footsteps were too deliberate, like someone was purposely trying to sneak closer, one step at a time. After a few seconds of just standing there, waiting to hear more sounds, everything went dead silent again. My heart was racing so fast I could barely think straight. One of my friends, Jake, tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just an animal. But you could see on his face that he didn't fully believe that. None of us did. All of a sudden, that isolated road and that abandoned car started feeling like a really bad idea. Like we had walked straight into something we weren't supposed to. I started saying we should just head back to our car and either keep driving or turn around. But then Mark, who had wandered a few steps toward the woods, looked back at us with a panicked expression and whispered, "Did you guys hear that?" And then we heard it again. But this time, the crunching of leaves was closer, and it seemed to be coming from multiple directions, like there was more than one person or thing moving around us. I felt totally exposed, just standing there, not knowing what to do, while that sound kept getting louder and closer. All of us were glancing around, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there, but nothing showed. Fear was quickly turning into panic, and I had this overwhelming urge to just bolt out of there. But at the same time, I didn't want to leave that strange car and everything else behind without understanding what was going on. The mix of adrenaline and confusion had me completely frozen, not knowing what else to do. I took a few steps back toward our car, keeping my eyes on the forest, trying to spot any movement. My whole body was on edge. Every little noise felt magnified. My friends were just as freaked out, too scared to even move. The sound of footsteps became more irregular, like someone was trying to sneak up on us, stopping every few steps. It felt like we were being watched, like this was some twisted game where something or someone would jump out at us at any moment. I had this gut feeling that if we didn't get out of there soon, something really bad was going to happen. Finally, Jake, who was visibly the most freaked out, whispered that we should get back in the car and leave. Without hesitating, we all rushed back, slamming the doors and locking everything as fast as we could. I turned the ignition with a shaking hand and started to reverse down the narrow road, when suddenly, the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road, just a few yards behind the abandoned car. It was a person, standing with their back toward us, completely still. I kept my eyes glued on that figure as I tried to keep the car steady on the road, feeling my heart pound out of my chest. None of us dared to speak. We just stared, unable to process what we were seeing. As we kept reversing, the figure remained completely still, as if they didn't care about being caught in our headlights. That whole scene felt surreal. When we were finally a safe distance away, Mark suggested we speed up and get out of there for good, but something made me hesitate. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure slowly turning to face us. That feeling of being watched intensified, and I swear a chill went down my spine. The figure looked tall and thin, and even from that distance, it felt like they were staring straight at us, like they'd known we were there the whole time. Without thinking any further, I floored the gas, and we took off as fast as we could. The bumpy dirt road made the car shake like crazy as we sped away from that place. The tension inside the car was thick. Nobody said a word, but it was obvious we were all struggling to make sense of what just happened. After a few minutes of dead silence, Jake finally asked if any of us had a clue what that was all about, but no one had an answer. All I could think about was that abandoned car and that eerie figure, standing alone in the middle of that deserted road. To this day, I have no idea what we stumbled across on that isolated road, but every time I think about it, that same chill creeps back over me. I decided to explore my city using one of those map apps, The ones that show areas you'd probably never think to check out. I had already wandered through some old residential neighborhoods, found a cool little diner, and stumbled upon a few interesting spots. But then, somehow, I ended up in this industrial area way out of the way, somewhere I'd never been before. You know that feeling when you just know you don't belong in a place? That's exactly how it felt. Too quiet, almost oppressive. But my curiosity got the best of me, and I kept going until I saw this old warehouse, totally abandoned. The place had a weird vibe, like someone had been there not too long ago. As I got closer, I noticed the door was slightly open, almost like it was inviting me in. I know, my rational side was screaming at me to leave, but for some reason, I just had to know what was inside. As soon as I stepped in, I was hit by this intense smell that made me feel sick to my stomach. It was weird and unsettling, but I couldn't figure out what it was at first. The floor was dusty and had all these strange marks, like there'd been some kind of activity recently. But what really got to me were the objects scattered around. Melted candles, burned pieces of clothing. Something about it just felt wrong, and this cold chill ran down my spine. I tried to ignore the feeling and kept looking around, but the smell kept getting worse. It was coming from a room further back, where the door was slightly cracked open, but I couldn't see anything from where I was. The smell was nauseating, like rotting meat mixed with something metallic that just hung in the air. I was on full alert at this point, but for some reason, I kept moving forward. Just as I took another step toward that room, I heard this faint sound, like something being dragged. That's when the fear kicked in hard, and I decided it was time to get out of there. I started backing away slowly, my heart racing, and all I wanted was to get back to my car. But as soon as I stepped outside, I almost had a heart attack. A little farther down, there was a car parked with its lights off, but I could make out the silhouette of someone sitting inside, watching me. By now, I was completely freaked out. My hands were shaking as I tried to figure out what to do. I had this feeling that whoever was in that car knew exactly what I'd seen in there, like they'd been waiting for me. I could barely breathe as I walked toward my car, trying not to look as terrified as I felt. As soon as I got in, I started the engine and quickly turned around, just wanting to get out of there as fast as possible. But the second I started driving, the car that had been parked down the road turned on its headlights and started following me. That's when the real panic set in. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, and the car stayed at this creepy, constant distance, like the driver was watching my every move but not trying to catch up. I kept turning down random streets, trying to lose them, but the car just wouldn't let up. My heart was pounding, and all I could think about was the weird stuff I'd seen in that warehouse. Had I stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see? Maybe something illegal? I didn't know, but it felt like whoever was behind the wheel wanted to make sure I remembered that I wasn't welcome there. I went through streets I didn't even know, just desperately trying to get that car off my tail, but it kept following me. After several panic turns onto random streets, I decided to make a sharp turn onto a narrow side road and then cut the lights, hoping to hide. I watched as the car sped past, not noticing me tucked away in the shadows. I waited there for a few minutes, barely breathing, trying to calm down and make sure they weren't coming back. My pulse was still racing, and I felt like I was being watched, even though I was alone. At that moment, I just wanted to be home, far away from that part of town. Finally, when I thought it was safe, I took a deep breath and headed home. Even on the way back, I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, convinced that car would show up again. But it didn't, though the fear didn't go away. I got home still shaken, not really sure what to make of what had happened. Part of me wanted to call the police, to report the warehouse, the smell, everything I saw, but I felt stupid. Who would believe me? And what if that driver was actually watching me? What if he was connected to whatever was going on in that place? I didn't end up calling the police that night. I just kept thinking about everything I saw and the person who followed me, trying to make sense of what I'd stumbled into in that industrial area. The smell, the candles, the burned clothes. It felt like something out of a horror movie. I barely slept, waking up constantly with that awful smell still somehow clinging to my nose, like I'd carried something back with me from that experience. The next day, I tried to go about my usual routine, but the curiosity wouldn't let go. I did a quick search to see if there were any recent news stories from that area, or if any crimes had been reported there, but nothing came up. The feeling of being watched stuck with me for days. I started to think I was seeing the same car around my neighborhood, always at a distance but never close enough for me to be sure. Every time I saw a car that looked remotely similar, my heart would skip a beat.